if we go to the training to get to the highest races in cycling, what was your training regime back when you were competing professionally?
So it was a real mix depending on the period of the year. So in a cycling season, the cycling racing season will kick off in January and you'll pretty much race through till the end of September. So it's a long season. So you can't be at your best form for 10 months of the year every year. So you would go through periods of the year where you'd have focal points where you'd really try and build into peak form. And there are points where you'd back it off and try and recover with the idea of sort of peaking sort of 2 or 3 times commonly. And I would sort of try and get maybe 4 peaks into a year. So when you're doing your sort of base training, you're building up your sort of pre-season training. A lot of it is about endurance work and doing hours on the bike. I think the biggest week I ever did on the bike was up to 42 hours of cycling a week. But on average throughout the year, I'd probably average in the low 20s. There are other periods of the year where you're really taking it quite easy, but you're still out on the bike basically every day.
Yeah.
Through a period where you're building up your intensity before an objective, it's a lot of interval training, a lot of high intensity work as well. And the sessions are pretty much typically 3 or 4 hours out on the road at a time. But over the course of my racing career, I pretty much averaged 30,000 kilometres a year for about 20 years. So that's about 1,000 hours a year.
Yeah. On Strava, I only know a few bike riders, but that's 30,000 is so much. Back to the 42-hour week. How far did you get with that?
How far do they do in 42 hours? So probably like 1,200 Ks.
In a week?
In a week, yeah, so, thereabouts. Yeah, 1,200, maybe nearly 1,300 Ks.
If you split that up per day, is it all pretty consistent, or is it like one day is a lot bigger and you tone it down the other?
Well, you can't afford to have too many light days when you're trying to do 40 hours of training a week, and that was a big endurance week. But there were days where I remember riding for, close to 300 kilometres. But every day is sort of well in excess of 150 when you're doing that kind of volume.
Yeah, wow. And it pays off though.
Yeah, and that's not every week. Yeah. There are weeks where you're doing big volume on the bike and you might do a 30-hour week or a 35-hour week. But then there are other weeks where you might only do sort of 12 or 15 hours, but they might be really intense.
And where are you doing this training? Like, do you find different courses for different scenarios, like big hills or like where do you actually ride?
So it depends where you are. I would do a lot of my pre-season training in Australia, where I'd be based out of Melbourne, or do a stint up in Brighton, do some training up in the hills up there. The area where I grew up in Mansfield, I do a lot of training up there in the countryside. And you try and mix it up. Depending on what you need to achieve on that particular session, I would try and sort of get a bit of variety in my training. And the beauty of being a cyclist is your training track are the roads. So you can train in various environments, you can train different roads, the scenery is always changing.
Yeah. And do you do it with other people?
Yeah, you can do it with other people. On a big week or when you're doing a long, sort of slow, steady ride, it's nice to have some company.
Yeah.
If you're doing some really specific interval work, you're doing that on your own because you're riding to your own numbers. So it's your own heart rate or your own power output, that sort of thing. So yeah, the recovery rides, the endurance rides, it's nice to do with a bit of company, but the real specific stuff you have to do on your own.